Hello, welcome to On the Line, Perspectives on Partition with me, Paul McFadden. This series of conversations organised by the Bloody Sunday Trust invites a variety of people from across the community to share their thoughts on the partition of Ireland a century ago this year, and indeed to share their views on only some of the things that have happened on this island in the 100 years since then. Today's guest is a friend of mine from what one might crudely call the other side of the tracks, and that's a political reference, not a class reference. He was once the communications director of the Ulster Unionist Party. He was closely aligned with the then David, now Lord Trimble. Nowadays, he's best known as an articulate political commentator and a prolific newspaper columnist in papers of all political stripes. His name is Alex Kane. Alex, it's great to see you again. Unfortunately, it's not face to face. It's remotely. It's virtually. It's down the line. But thanks for agreeing to join us for this conversation and a very important year in Northern Ireland's history. We're marking the centenary of partition. In June of this year, it'll be 100 years since the first Northern Ireland Parliament met at Stormont. Is it, in your opinion, an occasion for celebration?
Well, I'm always careful, as you know, Paul, and thanks for the invite to do this, by the way, with words like celebration, because every celebration, everything can be defined as a celebration for one side, and I don't just mean Northern Ireland, but across the world, usually has repercussions for the other side who don't see it the same way. I certainly think it's worth marking simply because of its existence. We've been here for a century. We've gone through an awful lot together, good and bad, moments of great hope, moments of great despair. I think it's also worth remembering it isn't just a centenary in the sense of one straight block. We've had three separate parts of that. We've had 50 years of unionist rule, and we've had 30 odd years of direct rule, and now we've had 21 years of power sharing, trying to work together, a new way of doing business. Each of those needs to be reflected and examined separately. And then, so I say, in the overall scheme of things, we're still here after 100 years. Historically, that is worth mentioning. But there are a lot of lessons that need to be learned from each of those separate parts of it.
Even when you mention those three distinct phases, it suggests there's a kind of direction of travel, if I could use that awful cliche, that it's moving more in a southerly direction almost than in east-west kind of a direction. Would that be fair?
Well, I think particularly since if you go the two big things in the early 70s, the prorogation of the Stormont Parliament and both the United Kingdom and Ireland joining the European Union, I think both of those things politically pushed unionism, nationalism closer together, in border relationships, and also pushed Britain and Ireland closer together. So yes, I'm not sure I would necessarily agree that it pushed it in a southerly direction, but I think certainly for the first time, the second half of Northern Ireland's centenary perhaps could be reasonably considered as the relationship north and south seemed to matter more than the relationship east and west. Primarily, I think, because from the prorogation of Stormont, from that period in sort of 72, 73, it became clear that, and we've seen it through the policies of successive UK governments, that what they were looking for in Northern Ireland was something into which both sides would be able to buy. The United Kingdom government wasn't saying, we will deal with this our way, this is how we will govern. They right from the 73 or the 72 Green Paper, which mentioned power sharing, which mentioned an Irish dimension. And remember, Paul, this was only months after Stormont had gone. And the British government made it quite clear as early as that whatever was coming in Northern Ireland, it wasn't going to be direct rule forever, because they didn't want that. It wasn't going to be a return to what had been. It was going to be something new. And that journey, I think, was what dominated and still dominate. Even now, we can see the difficulties with the executive. What we're still dealing with is the relationship between nationalism and unionism, between the political parties.
How obvious was that kind of change of tack on the part of the British government to people within the Ulster Unionist Party in particular, and within the broad unionist family in general?
I don't think it was obvious in the sense that they took it on board. I think they knew, I think they feared, Paul. I think there was a sense that there was something happening, that they were no longer in control of the agenda. And for good or bad, I don't want to get into a long, dispute about, whether it was 50 years of unionist rule or whatever and so on. You know my views. I think there are a lot of things unionism could have done and reached out, which it didn't do at that point. But I think it took unionism quite some time, because they didn't believe it. I remember I was up there with my father on the day, basically the last sit-in of the Stormont Parliament, when you had Brian Faulkner, Bill Craig, John Taylor, who just out of hospital after the assassination had been on him, all these people standing on the balcony. And at that moment, they knew something had happened, but they didn't fully understand. The Parliament, I mean, that's an extraordinary thing to think about it, Paul. A parliament is gone. People who used to run that parliament suddenly realized they'd been stripped of power. And it became, I think there was a sense, oh, we'll get this back. We might have to give a concession here or a concession there. But I think it took a very long time. You had to go through Sunningdale, the collapse of that experiment. You had to go through the Anglo-Irish Agreement. So it took maybe 25 years before unionism fully realized that whatever was going to happen in political terms in Northern Ireland, they couldn't exclude nationalism. They couldn't necessarily exclude republicanism. They couldn't exclude the opinions of the Irish government, because the Irish government was inputting into British thinking. So it took a very, very long time. And in that loss of time, I think unionism missed a lot of opportunities, because there were moments, and it was clear for some people that, it's going to be power sharing. It's going to be, concession. It's going to be some sort of new power sharing arrangement at the centre. I just think if unionism had accepted that much earlier and taken it on board much earlier, I think we would have got to 1998 much earlier as well, but in entirely different and probably more hopeful circumstances.
If it took quite a while for the penny to drop that unionists couldn't exclude nationalists and Republicans, has it really been embraced? Has it been embraced fully even now, which is some time after that realization?
Well, I think the problem, I don't think it has been fully embraced. And I think if you look back to 74, the Sunningdale experiment, I really hope then, I was 18 years old, my first vote and so on. I genuinely hope that this was a moment where unionists and, basically you make Northern Ireland work. I think you know me long enough, Paul, we've worked together in the past. I'm a firm believer in equality of citizenship. Whatever, I come from a unionist perspective, others come from a nationalist, but if you want to make a country work, you can't have a whopping minority, and I mean a whopping minority, not 5-10%, but maybe 40%. You can't just push them to one side and ignore them. It doesn't work like that.
Well, Alex,
but I think one of the problems we have now,
how could the 18-year-old Alex Kane realize that, see that, and other people who've been around the block for many years more not see, or if they could see, not admit to that?
I think it's because I had been steeped in politics my whole life. Even at 18, I had spent. My father was a fairly well-known unionist where we were. It was not unusual to have people like Brian Faulkner and Bill Craig and Terence O'Neill at the house for Sunday lunches, and they were dropping in before meetings and things like that. But I just knew, Paul, because I'd been just started O-level politics at that point and A-level politics. I just knew that if you wanted something to work, and it's one of those things when you're that age and you're steeped in politics. And I was adopted, as you know, my father, prominent Orange man, unionist, Presbyterian, the three pillars of unionism, all there. But he was a great liberal in the sense he always encouraged me, think for yourself, And the story, when I told him I wanted to support, I was minded to support power sharing and Sunningdale and so on. And he said, and I asked him, will you be disappointed, Dad? And he said, look, carry your own baggage. When you get to my age, you will have enough to carry. Don't take mine. You do not take mine. And so all that made me reflect, Paul. And also, I just think what sort of Northern Ireland I wanted, because at that stage, I was also thinking about university, where I wanted to go, where I wanted to live. And the one question at that stage, which I was aware of, which is why in Northern Ireland, I was living in Armagh at that point, where there were parts of the city I was encouraged not to go because it may not be safe. And yes, I know we had the trouble that started and so on, but reading, talking to people who were older than me and so on, this seemed to be the normal way of life across Northern Ireland. We had us and them areas. And I just thought, okay, this is not normal. And if there's an opportunity at this stage, maybe to say, well, let's try doing something differently. I was young, Paul. I was willing to take the chance at that stage. And I know I had friends of the family who'd been killed by the IRA, and I knew all of that. But at that stage, call me naive if you want, but I just thought, if you're going to do things differently, then you have to change. And I thought, this has never happened before. This vote on power sharing has never existed. I wasn't aware of it. This is the first time ever my generation has been given this opportunity. And that's why I voted for it, because I genuinely believe. I knew the SDLP were nationalists. I had no doubts about that. I knew that they wanted a united Ireland. But I also knew, Paul, there wasn't a majority for united Ireland. So let's make the place work as best we can. And from a unionist perspective, if it works well, if there's ever going to be, some sort of vote on unity, enough. Let's Catholics, small N, nationalists, whatever you want to call them, will go, actually, the place is okay. Let's not rock any boats. And I just think that, to me, was it. And that view has steered my strategic thinking my whole life. If you want the union to survive under any circumstances, then you want to make sure that you continually reach out and maximize the vote for the United Kingdom and for pro-unionism. The more people you put off, even from your own side, the more chances you are likely to have of losing.
How good a fist have unionists generally, and in recent years, we're essentially talking about the Democratic Unionist Party, who have been by far the strongest element within unionism. How good a fist have they made, in your opinion, of selling the union?
I think they've made it. They haven't done a good job, Paul, but I think it's worth saying, but just for some of your audience, you might see this. It goes back to the unionist psyche, and I think it's important to remember that unionism, let's call it Ulster unionism, was born at the time of the Home Rule crisis in the mid 1885-86. It was at that period we began to see something very specifically recognizable as Ulster unionism, not mainstream United Kingdom unionism, but a variety of it. And unionism didn't want 6 counties or 9 counties. It didn't want a border anywhere. It didn't matter. It didn't want 3 counties, heaved off to the south and the other, whatever is coming to stay in the United Kingdom. It didn't want any of that. And it ended up with something it never wanted. And Carson's old trope about, we were mere puppets, for the Conservative Party and the Conservative government. That all came into play. So when unionism ended up with Stormont in 1921, all it saw, Paul, were enemies around it. It saw the South, which wanted it. It saw a British government, which it didn't necessarily trust. It saw a minority in Northern Ireland, which it thought, well, these people are all bound to be, nationalists and United Irelanders, so let's ignore them. So there was that constant sense of fear and paranoia in the unionist psyche. And I think it's also worth bearing in mind with unionism that that old line that unionists can sniff a Lundy, in one drop of Lundyism in a million parts of orange juice, we can spot it. So anyone that says anything different is a Lundy, is a traitor, is betraying the cause. And that's why unionism is split right away. If you look particularly from 1972, the number of maverick parties, the number of offshoots, the number of unionist parties, Democratic Unionists, Ulster Unionists, Progressive Unionists, Popular Unionists, you name it, you name the word, and there's probably somebody's invented a party with that word before the Unionists. So all of that comes into play. And it's very difficult in those circumstances when you have so much division, when you have so much diversity. It's very difficult to get a central message, a controlling message, to get an overall message you can sell. And I think if you ask what the main problem of unionism has been, it has been that inability since 1972 in particular. And it goes back earlier than that. You go back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s when people in unionism tried to suggest doing things differently. But in my lifetime, Paul, I have just seen so many offshoots of unionism. It's a great story. I don't think I've told you about David McNary, a former Ulster Unionist MLA. And let's go back to the 1970s when somebody said, what you really need to do is find a way of bringing all of unionism together. So let's book a hotel in Portrush, take the parties up there and a few bits and bobs up there and see if we can come up with a central message. And it was David McNary who said, oh, don't be crazy. If you take 5 unionist parties and 3 ginger groups and leave them off on a Friday, you will come back on Monday morning to about 11 unionist parties and 7 and about 5 mavericks. He said, because that's what we do. And that's the problem. And even now, David, but 50 years later, is still trying to talk about unionist union. And that's the problem. If you ask what the difficulty was, it's not the unionists are preternaturally bad or wicked or bigoted or horrible or whatever it is. It's just they have found it almost impossible to come together with a coherent message and keep that coherent message. And even now with the protocol, they're talking about united unionist response. But already you're seeing these little cracks. And I think you know as well, I've spent years saying, guys, before we talk to the Irish about the Irish unity, before we talk about this, we need to talk to each other about what it actually is to be a unionist, what it means to be a citizen of the United Kingdom, and what values and beliefs we are championing and standing over, that we can say to people from other backgrounds, this is what it means and this is why we think it's worth keeping. We're just not good at that.
I'll ask you actually, Alex, to, in that sense, sell the union in a moment. But before I do that, I mean, you have never been backwards and coming forwards with your thoughts and your views. And when you say or spell out the kind of things that you've just been articulating now, when you say that to other unionists, and you've done it to unionists right across the board, how is that message coming from someone like you received by them?
I think actually they understand the message. I think they're in most cases people appreciate the message, which is why I get invited. I flatter myself that I get invited to talk to them, and they phone me and seek my input, and across all the parties here, Paul.
Yeah, oh, I know that actually. Yeah. But within unionism, but because you're spelling out a lot of blunt truths,
But that's what it's about. That and what it comes down to is what I was saying now. That if you want to sell the union, if you want to sell the vision of the union, you need to know what it is, because there's no point. And people always say this to me. The number who said to me, Alex, if all unionists were like you, we wouldn't have the problems. And that's the difficulty, because when the SDLP and Sinn Féin speak, separately, or they speak with, you know what it is, you know what their vision of nationalism, the nation once again holding the flame, relighting the torch, you know the vision. Then they take it to unionism, and I'll say so. You can have 10 unionists in a room having a debate, and you will get 10 entirely different versions. Other than we want to stay in the United Kingdom, we don't want a united Ireland. And I think that's the other thing within unionism, Paul. There's so many varieties of unionism. It's the churches, it's the loyal orders, it's the multiplicity of unionist parties, it's civic unionism, it's secular unionism, it's small u unionism, it's pro-Brexit unionism, it's anti-Brexit unionism, all of that. And that's why I keep saying you need to. Peter Robinson a few years ago talked about the need, to set up a council for the union, which would bring in academics, thinkers, and so on, to create an overall message. And maybe in some cases do what Sinn Féin did. Whatever, you think of Sinn Féin and the Unity Project. And I've spoken to some of their groups. They do work. They do enormous amount of homework and research and publicity and getting reports out on the economic consequences, the social consequences, the educational consequences. All I'm saying, Paul, from a unionist perspective, as someone who supports the union, all I'm saying is that unionism just needs to get better, because there's this impression that all unionists are thran, dar, difficult, and the only words in their lexicon are no, never, and so on. And yet I know I'm 65 now, and I've been involved. I've joined the Ulster Unionist Party when I was about, I think it was 1971. So I was young when I joined as a youth member. I know, Paul, that the vast majority of people and the common message from all, going back to what you originally asked me, the common message from all of them is, how can we not just get one simple, easy to understand message? And for me, that's if I've had a lifetime, goal, that would be it. That unionism is much better understood, not just by nationalism, not just by Dublin, but more important, perhaps, Paul, understood by people in England, Scotland, and Wales.
Yeah, Alex, I mean, if you ask many thinking people on the nationalist Republican side of the line for their understanding of what unionism is about, they could give you any list of adjectives that would be negative ones. They think bigoted and small-minded and those things that you yourself said a moment ago. But could I ask you, as an avowed unionist, you are a committed unionist, could you sell to me the union, the best of unionism as you see it?
That's an extraordinarily difficult challenge, Paul, simply because, as it goes back to the problem that unionism is such a diverse family. I know what I mean by unionism. I know exactly what I want, which is I used to describe myself as a pan-UK unionist, in the sense that anything that is legal, and acceptable and permissible, in England, Scotland, and Wales should be permissible here, which is why, I mean, people used to describe me as a liberal. But when it came to homosexual law reform, same-sex marriage, abortion, and things like that, whatever my own moral difficulties may have been on some of those issues, there was always that sense, if a woman in England, Scotland, and Wales can go somewhere and get an abortion as legal as no hassle, it was morally, fundamentally, politically wrong to say to a woman in Northern Ireland, tough, you're going to have to go somewhere else. That was wrong.
That's your commitment to democracy too, Alex, and you've always been consistent in that,
Well, but that's what I'm saying. That
yeah.
And I always think for unionism, again, it's difficult. The selling part, Paul, is that I'm still at that stage where many of us would be. We're still trying to sell this whole image of unionism to people who would describe themselves as unionists. And it goes back to what I said earlier. There's a sense unionists always feel that somehow they're on the losing side. Now, I would argue that, and I can understand, I fully understand the difficulty, particularly something like abortion. And I think we've been through, Karen and I've been through 4 miscarriages. I know what it's like. I know what it's like when the child is lost. I know that the sheer grief that just cripples you for weeks on end. So yeah, I can see the arguments of those who are anti-abortion and so on. But I also know that having been adopted and done an awful lot of research into women who were forced basically to have children and lost those children. Well, we know the whole migrant story, all of that. So you have to see both sides. So it's not a loss that someone who is gay is able to marry someone who knows. That's not a loss of your unionism. That's not a loss of your identity. And I think it's this thing that somehow, I mean, it is remarkable. It's ironic almost that there are probably more nationalists supporting, this liberalisation that you see in Dublin and London across the UK than there are unionists. And I think so. The unionism I'm selling, Paul, and I'm still in that process and probably will be till my dying day, is that to be a unionist, we have to get away from a world which we are seen as a place apart, because
I hope your dying day is a long time away, and it's quite possible that unionists will have to have their act together before then, because on the horizon at some point, I'm not sure how close, but on the horizon is the prospect of a border poll, and at that point, unionism might need to have its arguments in favour of the union marshalled sufficiently to garner some support from within what might be regarded as the perceived nationalist, Republican, Catholic community. Would you fear the prospect of a border poll, and would you be prepared to abide by the outcome of a border poll, whatever that outcome?
I don't fear democracy, Paul. You know that. So and I think you're right. I think it's inevitable. It's coming. I knew when it was put into the Good Friday Agreement, about in the event of blah blah blah, there would be a border poll. But that goes back. You go back to the constitutional guarantee. Goes back to the very start of Stormont. It's included in the 1973 documents. It was included in the Anglo-Irish Agreement. It's been included everywhere that the only way Northern Ireland ceases to be part of the United Kingdom is by a border poll. And it was inevitable. As demographic shift and other things shift, it seems to me inevitable that border poll will come. Yes,
Alex, and you're right. I mean, I do know that you will respect the outcome, but I understand that. But maybe I phrased the question incorrectly. Might it come too quickly for your liking, albeit a democratic expression of where people stand and what they think, but might it come too quickly for your liking?
I think yes. I take your point, Paul. I think that is a possibility, and that will worry me. Which is why I think, and we've heard Peter Robinson and other people say that unionism needs to sit down and work out what that message is, because you can't have in the middle of a border poll campaign, I could imagine Colm Eastwood and Mary Lou McDonald, Michelle O'Neill sitting having a meeting, and they might have a couple of nuances here and there, but you couldn't put a bus ticket between them. bring 7, 8 people from unionism, put them around the table, you know, to sell to an audience. Yeah, you would get more than nuance. You would get quite open differences. I think that's why this thing at some point always, it again goes back to my dad, which is another piece of advice was, and he was a former civil servant and so on, but he said always have option papers, no matter what happens. Have everything worked out. You know, you may not be able to game plan every single thing. They didn't know the word in those days, but no matter what happens, if A goes down, paper A goes down, have paper B ready. Now incorporate some of A. If paper B goes down with a bit of A, have C ready. So by the time you get to the end, most of what you want will somehow be incorporated. You've had to give a little here, get a little there. That's what you do. The problem, I think, with unionism, we don't entirely know what we want, other than we want to stay in the United Kingdom. And there are two big things here. It's, well, from a unionist point of view, it's difficult because it's hard to counter that argument. People say, well, sure, you've been betrayed. You know, from a unionist perspective, you were betrayed by Edward Heath when he shut down Stormont. You were betrayed by Thatcher with the Anglo-Irish Agreement. You've been betrayed by, you know, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, and so on. Why would you guys want to be, you know, linked to a system that doesn't seem to want you? That's the other thing. But who's going to come in the event of a border poll? Who's going to come from London, you know, that is going to make the cause for unionism? You know, I mean, some of them are nuts, clinically nuts, and I'm not sure, you know, I would want them, you know, making that cause for me. But yeah, you just need to be able to say, you know, I suppose there's an economic, socio-economic case. You know, how do you counter those who say, well, you know, it's just not enough, I mean, to say that, oh, well, you know, in the United Ireland, you wouldn't have the National Health Service. The reality is, well, we don't know if we wouldn't have the National Health Service, because if it gets to that point of a debate, all cards are off the table, because the United Ireland, no one is alive today who has any recognition of what the United Ireland is there. Because the last time we did United Ireland, all of it was in the United Kingdom, you know. So this notion that somehow you're going back to, you know, you can, you know, you're rebooting a computer, it's going to be entirely different. You know, the economics people say, oh, it's cheaper to buy a house in Dublin, that are more expensive to buy a house in Dublin than it is in Belfast, you know, and roads are worse here. And all those arguments, we don't know. Nobody knows what all. Look at East Germany. I always say to people, look at the great debate over the unification of Germany when that happened, you know, when the wall failed out. If you ask people on both sides, they say, oh God, no, it's nothing like we expected it to be. There were so many things that we hadn't factored in, had to all be part, and, you know, concessions had to be made that they never expected to have to. And that's going to be the same if there's a United Ireland. And how can you accommodate unionism? Is it possible to accommodate unionism? What are the economics? I mean, I heard one person say to me in terms of the British, I said, what's the British input afterwards? He said, oh, hundreds of millions of reparations. I have to tell you, Paul, my gut instinct would be that if we vote, if Northern Ireland votes to leave the United Kingdom, set up a United Ireland, I'm not sure how keen a country which, you know, which is an English nationalism that isn't really mad keen on paying the subs anyway for England, Scotland, and Wales, is going to be mad keen to be told, oh, by the way, you know, Northern Ireland will be in a United Ireland, but we're expecting you to pay, you know, hundreds of billions over 30, 40, 50. All of that has to be taken in. And the other great clash in all of this, Paul, is going to be the difference between, if you like, the head arguments, about the economics, about the education, about the health, about the economy, all of that, and the heart. Because you know, and I know, that there are people on both sides who would eat, I won't use the word I was going to use there, but they would eat anything that was offered to them, you know, rather than, you know, live in the United Ireland or stay in the United Kingdom, you know. So we don't know how much the heart, you know, is going to play. I can't, this, a number of things play my own mind in terms of whether I could ever be persuaded to vote for United Ireland. And you know, I'm a reasonable man. I listen to all arguments. I'm not sure, Paul, I could ever put my tick, even with all the things I think about the United Kingdom, the difficulty with Johnson and the difficulty with maybe a new Scotland leaving and things like that. But there's an emotional side of me, and I don't think that emotional side can ever be trumped by the economic side. And that applies to nationalism as well. But I don't know. I don't know what my Megan, my 22-year-old, would do. You know, I've told her, given the advice my father gave me, you know, carry your own baggage, sweetheart. I don't know what the young want, because I'm 65. I'm not going to pretend I know what matters, particularly to a 20-year-old right now. So all of that, Paul, has to be factored in. But this notion that somehow it's a straight binary choice, it's anything but that. But if you have a situation, I think what's key to this is that when the border poll comes, it will be because the British government and the Irish government have agreed to have it. Sinn Féin and the SDLP will have done a lot of work. There's huge work going on within civic nationalism, at the moment. I just worry, as a unionist, I just worry that unionism goes back to your point, will it come too early? If unionism is not ready right now, right this minute, the minute you switch this interview off and Boris Johnson and Micheál announce a border poll, it's too late for unionism because we're not ready. You must work on the basis, always be ready for any moment that comes, any eventuality. Be prepared, have done the homework, have the arguments ready to marshal, have the campaign ready to roll. I don't see much evidence of unionism being ready for that.
Alex, I could talk to you all day,
Please don't.
I'm going to finish this discussion with a tribute to your father, a product of the three pillars of unionism as you described it earlier on, but a man who's produced someone like yourself who has such a strong commitment to democracy and has such, as a person of such eminent good sense and reason. And I think just that sometimes, if people do engage with one another and discuss with one another and mention their fears and spell out their fears and basically try and understand one another, try and walk in one another's shoes for a mile or two, we can perhaps surprise ourselves with what we can achieve, and I think it's important that kind of process begins as quickly as possible.
I was going to say, Paul, just very briefly in that, one of the things that it doesn't worry me in one sense, but I think it'd be a good thing if it happened. I get invited to speak to a lot of audiences who would not be pro-union audiences or unionist audiences, and that can range Sinn Féin, SDLP, civic nationalism, just groups of people, who phone me and say, "Look, Alex, we're a little group that meets once a week. Would you come and talk to us and discuss through this?" It rarely happens within that. Unionism invites people with a different views from the other side, and you're right, Paul, because I think if we sit down and talk to each other, I look at you and I look at lots of people I've worked with over the years, of people. I'm always glad when people says, "You two work so well together. You just time for each other. You listen to each other," and I think if the poll is coming at some point. It may not be 5 years of it. It's coming at some point. The more we learn to talk to each other, to explore each other's interests and concerns and so on. And just the very fact, a number of people have said to me, I've said, "Alex, I've never quite understood, this unionism until I explained the psyche thing." I said, "These are people who constantly thought they were going to be betrayed by someone or other, And I said, I'd never considered that before. And I think sometimes the more insight we give to the, if you like, the other side of what matters to us, the easier it is to engage in all future. And I sometimes wish the DUP and Sinn Féin, I don't know, if I'd send them off to that hotel and liquor them up and just say, "Look, guys, no mobile phones, no cameras, no anything. Just sit down and talk about whatever the hell you want to talk about." And maybe it's like Robinson said about McGuinness. I think it was football for them. They just were able. There was something. I think I don't do any sports, but I think they supported the football team. I remember Peter saying we were able to have this conversation. But they didn't love. There was no love in that sense, but they realized it had to be a business relationship. I think maybe that's what it all comes down to. Just assume that when you live in a divided society, the more easily we can do business together, the better. And don't diss people. A lot of people I fundamentally disagree with, but you said about walking in their shoes, and it's because I was adopted, so identity for me is a very important thing.
Yeah.
What matters most to me when I talk to people is why they reach that conclusion. And so when people say to me, "I'm a unionist," "I'm a unionist, I've always been," I go, "Why? Why are you a unionist? Is it because your parents, come from a unionist background? Is it because your parents said you had to be? Have you ever considered what it's like?" And the same with people who would be Republicans. I say, "But why? Why? You're anti-unionist. Why? Is it just because of this or that? Or have you thought?" And that's the whole point, Paul. No matter what it is, no matter what happens at border polls, for God's sake, we need to learn to actually have civil conversations across dinner tables with people from opposing sides without being too embarrassed to, "Oh, well, let's not have the conversation." We need to learn to talk. I'll shut up now because I've obviously talked too long.
Well, Alex, look, this civil conversation has been both a pleasure and an education. I enjoyed it immensely. Thanks for taking the time to speak to us on the line. Share your perspectives on partition. And I hope the next time that we meet that it is face to face and that it happens sooner rather than later. Thanks for joining us, Alex Kane.